Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of State of Mind. This will be part 26, the second half to chapter 17. Shoto laid in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, his phone laying on the blanket next to him. The group chat had been non-stop talking about Izuku, and Shoto had grown tired of it quickly. He was worried about his friend. Seeing him unresponsive and hurt, covered in bandages and just so broken, had torn him up. He just didn't want to hear any more about it, even if it was selfish of him. A different ping from his phone had him grabbing it and holding it over his face with a frown, checking the notification. When he saw that his delivery had arrived, he sat up quickly, grabbing his bag to throw over his shoulder, jumping off his bed, and rushing to the front door, throwing on his shoes. "Where are you going?" Fuyumi yelled from the living room. "Hospital," he yelled back, opening the door hard enough to hit the wall behind it. Shoto's sister exclaimed something, but he didn't hear her, as he scooped up the package that had been dropped off and took off to the train station. The train ride itself took too long, and Shoto ended up unwrapping the gift and tossing away the packaging, then going into the hospital gift shop to grab a gift bag and a last-minute add-on he thought Izuku would like to drop in on the top. He then jumped into the elevator to ride up, but suddenly found himself hesitating for some reason outside the door to Izuku's hospital room, staring at the dark green gift bag clutched in his hand. Was this a thing that friends did? Would this even help Izuku? Was this weird? Should he even go in? The decision was made for him when the door suddenly opened and Aizawa stood there, looking down at him in surprise. Shoto looked up in equal amounts of confusion. For a usually uninterested hero, Aizawa seemed to be around Izuku a lot. "Come to see Izuku?" Aizawa asked, after staring at him briefly, using his first name again. They must be more familiar with each other than Shoto had thought, and he abruptly remembered Izuku's use of "we" in his text that one time. "Yeah," he answered flatly. Aizawa narrowed his eyes and seemed to be looking over him critically, as if searching for something. Shoto resisted the urge to shift uncomfortably. "I needed to go do something anyway. Keep an eye on him, would you? He's not supposed to be alone." And with that, Aizawa was walking away, slouched, hands in his pockets. Shoto watched his receding back with a frown. Why couldn't Izuku be alone? Shoto shrugged, and then, with a deep breath, he walked through the door, barely limping at all anymore, his knee almost fully healed, though there was a large burn scar there now. He would try to not let Izuku see it for as long as possible. He knew the boy would feel guilty about it, no matter what Shoto said. Inside, Izuku was sitting up and looking out the window, messy hair covering half of his face. Shoto noticed the bandages on his face were gone now, revealing a long horizontal scar over his eyes. He wore mint green hospital clothes, and his arms and legs were bandaged beneath them, the blanket shoved away from him. Shoto imagined there were more scars hidden under his hair and his bandages, and his gut twisted. "Hey, Izuku," he murmured. Izuku's head slowly turned to him, and Shoto had to refrain a gasp. He could now see the deep purple eye bags decorating his face, as well as more scars showing through his absolute mess of hair. I brought you something." Shoto swallowed, holding up the green gift bag. There was no response, and Shoto pressed his lips together, before crossing the room to stand next to the bed. He gently set the bag down next to Izuku, and when the boy didn't make any move to open it, he pulled the extra item from the top of it and set it down on Izuku's lap, blushing lightly. Maybe it had been a bad idea to get him an All Might-themed teddy bear. A random purchase with no thought. Shoto was such a... Izuku reached forward, lifting the bear up in his hands, eyebrows drawing together as he made a strange, hoarse sound in the back of his throat. Shoto found himself leaning forward slightly, excited. "I got you something else," he said, reaching into the bag. "It took a while to get here. I actually ordered it before." Shoto froze, eyes flicking to Izuku's. He didn't seem to notice. It took time to find it, too, because I wasn't sure what exactly it was, but... Shoto pulled out the black long-sleeve shirt and held it up in front of Izuku, letting it fall unfolded to reveal the skeleton in an astronaut suit on the front of it. Izuku gasped, eyes going wide. You seemed pretty upset about bleeding all over yours, so... Shoto shrugged, looking down, kind of embarrassed now. When he looked back up, Izuku's emerald eyes were watering, his lip trembling. Shoto winced, dropping the shirt. Had he done something wrong? Fuck, Shoto always screwed everything up. I'm sorry. He backed up a step. I didn't mean to. Izuku shook his head rapidly, mouth opening and closing several times, his eyes crinkling as if in pain. It's okay, you don't have to talk. Shoto stepped forward again. Do you like it? Izuku nodded viciously, and Shoto breathed a sigh of relief. That's good. Shoto was at a loss for words. Should you sleep? You look pretty tired. Izuku gestured at the bed, frowning. The bed? He asked, and Izuku nodded. What about the couch? Shoto pointed to the couch in the corner of the room. Izuku sighed and held up an arm, then pulled down his shirt to show his chest. Shoto noticed the IV on his arm and the electrode bulges beneath his bandages under his shirt, probably for the heart monitor. So, he couldn't get very far from the bed. That wasn't a hard fix. Shoto walked over to the couch and grabbed one side of it, heaving it over to the side of the bed. He adjusted it so that it was as close as possible, while Izuku watched him in obvious surprise. Here, he said, dropping his bag down and sitting himself down on the couch smugly. Izuku stared at him for a moment, before grabbing the shirt Shoto had gotten him, and he pulled it on over the hospital shirt and the lines connected to him. After that, he slithered carefully off the bed, and the stuffed animal was in one hand as he moved onto the couch. He sat next to Shoto, smoothing the wrinkles out of the shirt with his bandaged hands, running his fingers over the design of the skeleton astronaut. I'm glad you like the shirt, Shoto whispered. Izuku nodded, and then tried to run a hand through his hair, wincing when it caught in a tangle. Shoto spoke up. I have a comb in my bag, I could... Izuku was nodding again, and Shoto smiled, reaching into his bag to remove his comb. His own hair was thin and straight and tangled easily, so he tried to keep one on him usually. Izuku scooted forward, and Shoto blinked in surprise. He hadn't realized Izuku wanted him to brush his hair, though it made sense with his injuries. Shoto swallowed and reached up, starting at the bottom of Izuku's hair and pulling it through the tangled waves and working his way up. Izuku, he whispered. There was no response, but Shoto felt like his friend was listening, so he went on. I am sure you think you're weak right now, but do you remember what I said during the sports festival? There was a slight nod under the hair comb pulling through the tangles, signaling that Izuku remembered. Good. I still mean it. You've gone through things that I really wish you hadn't, but you're only going to be stronger because of them. You're strong and brave, Izuku. I believe in you. Izuku looked back at him, his eyes watering as he seemed to search Shoto's soul before eventually nodding and turning back away. Shoto, having said what he wanted, went back to brushing Izuku's hair. The more time passed, the closer Izuku got to Shoto until he was sagged completely against Shoto's shoulder, his eyes closed, and his chest moving evenly. Shoto smiled and finished with his hair, even if it was a bit more difficult now, combing it until it was smooth and silky. Izuku remained asleep for some time after that, eventually shifting in his sleep to curl up against Shoto, his head on his shoulder, and his arms clutching around Shoto's left arm like a life raft, holding him afloat, his legs curled up on his other side, and his IV and monitor lines trailing over Shoto's body. Shoto looked down at Izuku, his hair no longer blocking his face. There were multiple scars on his face now. The horizontal one on his forehead, then a long vertical one stretching from right below his left eye and almost to the corner of his lip, and then another crossed diagonally near the top of that scar, from the middle of the bridge of his nose across the other scar and ending a bit before his ear, making a large, crooked and misshaped X. Shoto felt horrible, and he couldn't stop thinking about everything Izuku must have gone through in those few days of being gone. Shoto sighed and drew his hand through Izuku's now untangled hair, leaning his head back. He was glad that Izuku was comfortable enough to fall asleep on him, even after everything that he had gone through. Shoto looked at him sadly, remembering the serene moment when Izuku had waxed poetic about the twilight sky. He thought about how much had changed since then, how much Izuku had suffered since, how many scars he had acquired since. Shoto cleared his throat and laid his head on Izuku's, closing his eyes but remaining awake. Izuku had not deserved everything that had happened to him, and Shoto felt horribly guilty that he had not been there for any time that Izuku needed him. That was how they were when Aizawa finally returned, Shoto's eyes snapping open when he heard the door open. Aizawa walked in, followed closely by... Was that Mike? He looked strange out of his hero costume, long blonde hair in a messy bun, normal glasses pushed high on his nose. Aizawa was no longer in his hero costume either, wearing a black poetic t-shirt that said, "Roses are red, I'd rather be in bed," and black jeans. They both looked... weird. Both teachers looked at them in surprise. "Oh, good. He's finally sleeping," Present Mike said, after a moment with a sigh of relief, as he set a bag on the counter. "I brought his favorite food, but I'll wait until he wakes up." Both heroes sat down in the chairs at the bedside, both looking almost exhausted as Izuku. "Has he spoken at all yet?" Shoto asked after a moment of silence. "No, not really," Mike answered sadly. "I think he just needs time." Shoto glanced down, concerned. "Did you get him that shirt?" Aizawa asked, a brow raised. Shoto looked back up and nodded. "He seemed pretty upset about bleeding all over his after the mall incident," Shoto said, and would have shrugged if there wasn't a sleeping green bean on him. He wondered how long he would be stuck there with Izuku, using him as a living body pillow, and he got out his phone to do some reading while he waited. The two teachers likewise started doing paperwork. Turns out it didn't end up actually being that long. Izuku began twitching and groaning under his breath after only an hour of rest. Aizawa looked up at the movement and sounds, frowning, ready to use his quirk if need be. "Izuku," Shoto whispered, setting his phone down and reaching a hand up. "Don't touch him," Aizawa warned. "He gets violent sometimes." Shoto hesitantly dropped his hand back down as Izuku slowly and painfully became more conscious, until suddenly his eyes fluttered open, and he blinked rapidly, leaning back away from everyone with a sharp inhale, eyes widening. He looked up at Shoto. "Sorry," he croaked, releasing his arm, and then freezing, eyes wide, glancing around the room as each person looked at him with various expressions of relief and surprise. He'd spoken, his own voice seeming to have taken him by surprise. And of course his first word after so long would be an apology. Of course it would be. His voice had come out rough and painful sounding from disuse, but he had still spoken, and everyone in the room was proud. "Good to hear you again, little listener." Mike smiled and then stood. "You up to eating something?" Izuku hesitated, but nodded after a moment, and the voice hero's grin widened as he stood up to walk over to his bag. Izuku looked down at his hands, his hair falling back over his face. "You don't have to be sorry." Shoto finally responded to what his friend had said. Izuku did not respond, continuing to look down at his hands. Shoto sighed, and then after a minute, Mike returned with a bowl of katsudan. "Izuku, here you go." So they both called him by his given name, Shoto observed. "Izuku?" Mike asked, his smile slipping. Shoto turned his attention back to Izuku and found that he hadn't moved. He lifted a hand and gently tapped Izuku's shoulder. The boy flinched away, gasping, lifting his head, eyes flicking around the room rapidly. Shoto raised his hands in a mollifying gesture, and Izuku calmed down after a second, closing his eyes, forehead creasing, new scar crinkling. Sorry, he swallowed. No worries, little listener. Here's your favorite, made it myself and everything. Mike smiled, and when Izuku didn't reach for it, he set it down on his legs. He had thought to bring a spoon instead of chopsticks, taking into account Izuku's shaking hands. Izuku hesitantly ate a few bites while the others were pretending that they weren't watching, keeping an eye on him. Izuku only managed a few bites before lifting the bowl and handing it back to Mike, who just seemed glad that Izuku had managed to eat something. Shoto stood after that, stretching his arm a bit. I should go, he said. Father is probably wondering where I am. Izuku looked up at him, narrowing his eyes. Shoto lowered his voice. Don't worry, I'm fine. Izuku sighed at his words and looked away. Thank you for coming, Todoroki. Shoto nodded to him, the larger gratitude unspoken, but Shoto understood. He had somehow managed to help Izuku, and for that he was glad. He gave a small wave before leaving. Time passed strangely after Izuku had woken up, as he went through disassociation after panic attack after disassociation. It felt like it took forever for him to finally begin to have some semblance of reality again. Izuku remembered bits and pieces of days passing. He remembered his mom relinquishing complete guardianship of him. That was fun. He remembered people talking to him. He remembered feeling lost and alone, drowning in his own mind. He felt like his mind had been shattered and torn apart, and his soul was in pieces. He didn't know who he was anymore. It took Shoto bringing him that gift to finally really get him to resurface in any capacity. And then the sleep had helped, even if he'd had nightmares of Toga and Shigaraki and Dabi. Then Shoto left, and Izuku snuggled into his new favorite shirt, even better than the first because a friend had gotten it for him, rather than just getting it for himself. He had never known how nice it was for people to care enough to notice the things he liked and then actually go get it for him. It meant a lot to him. Are you okay to speak now, Izuku? Aizawa asked cautiously, watching him. Izuku wondered. It had been strangely hard to speak, but Izuku felt like he could make a better attempt now, so he nodded. He didn't want to speak, though. He didn't want his voice to betray how lost and broken he was. Okay. Tsukauchi wants to speak with you to go over everything that happened, Aizawa said, and Izuku shrank into himself, flinching. You don't have to today, or even tomorrow. Just soon, okay? Izuku nodded, and then lifted his head from his arms. He wished he had his phone, but it was lost or destroyed somewhere during the fight with Muscular. Yagi, Izuku rasped. Mike frowned, leaning forward in his seat. You want to speak with Yagi? Izuku nodded, wincing when the movement made his vision swim. He should be here soon, Aizawa answered with a sigh. For now, though, do you remember what happened when your mother was here? Izuku nodded, and buried his face back into his arms. How do you feel about it? Mike asked worriedly. Izuku shrugged, and the room fell silent after that until there was a knock on the door, and Yagi walked in, several bags in his hands. He blinked, taking in Izuku on the couch instead of the bed in stride, understanding. He set the bags on the counter. Are you feeling a bit better, young Izuku? Izuku nodded stiffly, and then Aizawa stood, yawning. Izuku wants to talk to you. Mike and I'll go grab a coffee or something. The two crossed the room, and Aizawa leaned close to Yagi's ear, and Izuku barely caught his whispered threat to the #1 hero himself. If you know what's good for you, do not stress him out. Then he moved on as if nothing had happened, and they both left the room. a thick quiet overtaking the air. Yagi cleared his throat and walked forward to sit on the bed in front of Izuku. "Are you all right, my boy?" Izuku opened his mouth, frowning. "Didn't give one for all." Yagi leaned back in surprise, brows drawing together. "Young Izuku, you shouldn't be worrying about that. My first and foremost concern is your health." Izuku swallowed, rubbing his throat. Yagi got up and brought him a cup of water, which Izuku chugged greedily before wiping his mouth. "Better?" he asked, taking a sip of his own water, and Izuku nodded, clearing his throat. "Saw Nana," he said, and Yagi did a literal spit take, spewing water onto the front of his shirt, coughing violently, the taste of iron in the back of his throat. "You what?" he rasped, rubbing his chest. Izuku nodded, setting his chin on the arms that were wrapped around his knees. "And another holder, Banjo. They helped." Yagi cleared his throat, trying to comprehend what his successor was saying. "So, you saw the predecessors?" Izuku nodded. "Were they ghosts?" Izuku shook his head, frowning. "Dreams, I think." He was grimacing, as if it was getting more difficult to speak. "Well, I'm glad they helped. Nana was always... She was always very kind," Yagi whispered, and Izuku nodded, agreeing. "For now, though, I brought you some things." The hero stood up to grab the bags, bringing them back to the bed and setting them down, before turning to meet Izuku's eyes. "But first, young Izuku, I want you to know how proud I am of you. You were so strong and—" "What?" He stopped when he saw Izuku had hidden his face in his legs and was shaking his head. "Izuku!" He didn't answer, only continuing to shake his head, face hidden. "Izuku," Yagi sighed. "You have nothing to be ashamed of. You know that, right?" Izuku lifted his head, exposing the green pools that were his eyes. He didn't answer, and Yagi sighed. Maybe he just wasn't ready to talk about it yet. The hero pulled one bag forward, and from its depths he removed a box. "We found your cell phone near Muscular. It was broken beyond repair, so I got you a new one. I'm pretty sure if you sign into your account with your phone provider, they can change the number over." Yagi explained, and Izuku looked at the man in absolute shock, leaning back. Yagi took apart the box the phone came in, and then handed it to him. It lit up with the movement. Yagi scratched the back of his neck. "I noticed your, trouble with speaking, so I found a phone that has a pen of sorts in it, and you can write on the screen, like that notebook I saw you with when we first met. I know you like to write." Izuku choked on a sob, gasping, and Yagi internally cursed, resisting the urge to reach forward. "I'm sorry, I didn't think—" "Thank you," Izuku forced out, setting the new phone down and wiping his eyes against the bandages on his arms. He didn't finish, wiping more furiously at his eyes. "Don't try to force yourself to talk, my boy. It's all right." Yagi smiled, grabbing the rest of the bags and drawing them closer to him, pulling out various food items, a t-shirt, and a book on the history of quirks. Izuku looked up at him after glancing at the pile of loot, and didn't smile, but he did look better. He looked better. All right, listeners, this concludes the second half of Chapter 17 of State of Mind. Chapter 18 will be up next. Let me know your thoughts and reactions to this one. I really like the support that Izuku is getting through this recovery process, so I'm eager to hear what you all thought as well. And as always, thank you so much for listening.